We are going to be learning the Sicha Chelek Chafei Sicha Beis. It's a very you say this the Sicha on the Indian of Mila. And as we usually do, we start from the sources that the Rabbi speaks about, and then bring in the issues that the Rabbi is concerned about, and how he responds to it and explains it, and then discuss some points of what he talks about, of some of the ideas that he brings in. So the Rambam in Hilchos Mila, Peri Gimel Halacha Ches, writes. This is the end of Hilchos Mila. And he writes the following: Mu'usa hi ha'arla. Arla is the covering of the Mila is disgusting. The Goyim have been denigrated from it because of it. This is the way we denigrate them. The daily on Mila, on the other hand, Mila is so great. So that's point number one. Mila is disgusting. Arla is disgusting. Sorry. Gedaili, on the other hand, Mila is so great. Shalanikra Avram Avinu Shalem At Shemot. Avram Avinu became complete. Wasn't complete until he did a bris milah. Shnemes halach lefonai, ve'yetomim, ve'yesomim, ve'etna brisi beini uveinecha. Then you summon. You are complete at that point. Third point, that if chas v'shalom a person tries to destroy the bris and sort of cover the milah, then, or he leaves the arla, he doesn't have a chelek in el. Very strong statements about the importance of milah. But then he separates into a new halacha. Now, halacha tes, he writes, another series of greatness of milah, but in a different way. Boyer ei kama chamura milah. How serious and how harsh milah is important. In other words, it is such a strong mitzvah, a harsh mitzvah. The right word for chamura. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't even get 1 hour, one moment. The word sha'ah here is a broad term, meaning a period of time that would have been normal to have allowed for him, and yet he was almost killed, or his son was almost killed, depending on how you learn shot. Why? Because he didn't mal his son. And why didn't he mal him? Rambam is alluding to the fact that he was traveling and he couldn't do it. But he got into a hotel. Could have done it right there and there. And again, I'm not getting into that issue right now or today. It is very relevant to what we're learning, but it's not for the time constraint that we have. That's number one. Now, all the mitzvahs of the Torah have 3 bonds, so to speak, that the Eibishter makes with for every mitzvah. Once it says Eilu Divrei Bris. Besides the bris that was made another time it says bris. And then it says in Atam Nitzavim, and this is for all mitzvahs. So every mitzvah has three brisois. Mila nichnasu sholish esrei brisos. I'm not wrong. 13 times it says the word bris, and he goes through them. That number he gives a list. Starts with the what all those that say by the story of Avram being told in this week's parsha Lech Lecha. Okay, now it would be great, but of course nothing is ever great unless we analyze it and understand it. So let's understand. Where does the Rabbi get this from? He gets it from a Talmud Bavli and a Talmud Yerushalmi. And let's see the Bavli, and then we'll see the Yerushalmi. I realize that there are problems, which always come up. Mikari Devar, where's the marker? The source. The Gemara Mishnah in the Durham Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Beis says there. That the Rishoyim have been denigrated with it. As it says, all goyim are arei. It means the same pasuk as the Rambam, but a little change in the word there, but it's okay. We're not getting into that. Yishmael says, Mila's so great, it has Shleisha Brises, 13 Brises, as we said before. Rabbi Mila is so great that it can be done even on Shabbos. Even though Shabbos is so chomer. Moshe didn't even get a Molei Shah, a time span of which would have been normal to get, and he was punished for just delaying the Mila of his son. Now, just a note, he writes here an interesting phrase on Moshe, an interesting name for Moshe, which is never found again in Chazal, LeMoshe HaTzadik. Oh, Chen says Mila allows you to cut off a nega. Person has a tsaras, leprosy in the area of where the Mila has to happen. So he is allowed to cut. Usually you're not allowed to touch the Mila, the tsaras. You're allowed to. So that's how I'll show you how great Mila is. Which the Rambam mentioned. He's not considered shalom. The world wouldn't have been created. Okay, we're not going to get into all of these, but we're going to get into money of them. Now, where does the Rambam get the psukim of the Yud Gimel Brisis? He gets it from Yerushalmi. However, the Yerushalmi starts off with a different pasuk. He brings the pasuk by the bris ben absarim. Vayemu koras Hashem bris es Avram leimer, and he brings all the other psukim. So the Rebbe in that Sicha asks a number of questions. Why did the Rambam leave out the Yerushalmi's pasuk by Yemu koras Hashem bris, the pasuk of the bris ben absarim? Yeah. Interestingly, that's not the kasha that the Sicha is going to blend. The Sicha is going to build on why the Yerushalmi did bring it. Because it makes sense why the Rambam didn't bring it. Sorry, I have to finish my coffee, otherwise I can't function. Ubefrat, specifically, that this pasuk is the first pasuk that said way back. It said before, earlier in the Bash. It said before the mitzvah of Milah. Now, that's number 2. Now, number 3. The order of the Rambam in Halacha Ches. He starts off with Me'usa Allah, the greatness of Milah that At Shemol. He wasn't called Sholem. And then he brings Chalamei for Brisa Shel Avraham Avinu. that if somebody destroys the bris, in Lecha, in Halacha Tes, he continues, that Moshe wasn't given time and punished right away. The mitzvah, the fact that there's 3 brises on everything and 13 on Torah. Now, that the source of that is the Mishnah in the Dharam. The Rambam changes from the Mishnah. Mishnah has a whole different order, and the Rambam redoes the order, reorders it. Their Mishnah is Ma'usa, Shaish Esabrises, Mila's Deicha Shabbos, which I didn't even mention. Mila, that Moshe was punished. Mila's Deicha Negoim, again, what the Rambam didn't mention. And Ma'avram wasn't called Shalom. So why did the Rambam change the order? Why did he mess things up? And why did he separate them into 2 different halachas? Two different discussions here. Right? Okay. Also, in the Mishnah, the word is Gedei Lamila. Gedei Lamila, over and over. How great Mila is, how great Mila is. And the Rambam in the Halacha Tes switches to Chamura Mila. You see the detail in every word of Rambam, how important it is. And as he writes, when he writes Chol Mitzvah, he also writes Vich Chol Mitzvah. Is also going on the Chamura. Now, the Rambam compares it to the other mitzvahs. The Mishnah just says, it's not so much. That's it. Doesn't compare it to the rest of the Torah. The rest of the mitzvahs. Okay. Now, the simple, just to go on the Yud Gimel Brises, the simple reason why the Rambam did not bring the Pasuk Vayaymahu Karas, which was the beginning question, which I said the Rambam is going to reverse it as a problem on the Yishalmi, is as he writes in Pirush Mishnayis, right? Writes in Pirush Mishnayis. In the Pirush HaMishnah Sham, right? What does he write there? Pirush HaMishnayis. Peri Gimel Mishnah Yud in Nedarim. Shloish Eser Brises, Sitevas Bris, Ubrisi Shenich Letziva Hashem Lavram Mila. B'machze Echad Ba'atzme. In other words, it's those times it says Bris to Avram regarding his Bris Mila. And therefore it makes sense that he doesn't mention Bayay Mahu, Koras Hashem Bris, which was the Bris Ben Amsarm. It's a different discussion. It's not in the same Nevuah. It's not in the same time. Oh, if that's the case, what's that Yishalmi? I mean, Yishalmi has to make some sense. All right, this is all the buildup of the questions of the Rebbe, and now let's get involved with the answers. And there are a couple other questions which we're going to leave for later and come back and discuss them. To explain all this, this is the Yesod. This is the big breakthrough Yesod that is almost clear in the Rambam. When you read it after you know this Yesod, you can see it in the Rambam and other places. There are 2 parts to Bris Milah. There is the bris between the Eibishter and the Yidden, where the Eibishter connects to us and through Bris Milah in all parts of our being. In other words, and this is in a different way of saying it, but an easier way of saying it, that this binds us with the Eibishter and brings the holiness of the Jew. And then there's a mitzvah of a bris milah. What are the tayig mitzvahs? Yes, one happens with the other. Now, I'm not going to get into it, but I would like to suggest that there's a difference in how it happens. What is the important part between as with the Rebbe say, between the Yishalmi and the Bavli and the Rambam, and then why the Rambam changes from that. But again, it's above the discussion here. We want to focus more onto the main part of the Sicha. And we find by Milas Hager, when a Ger becomes a Jew, there's two parts. There's the Mila as Geirus, that he becomes part of Kedusha Yisrael. And Mila Kima Mitzvahs, and he brings this from the Ragat. And now, I want to just mention that the Rambam in Hilchis Isurei Bia, Perik Yud Beis Halacha Yud Aleph, uses the following expressions based on a Gemara, but the way he writes it, and again he writes it in Perik Yud Dalet Halacha Yud Zayin, he writes, "Avodim shed bilu eisam l'shem avdis v'kibel aleim mitzvahs," meaning they went through the process of what a gerus of an eved is. He writes, "Avodim kayom yotzu miklal ha'akum u'lechlal Yisrael le'bo." In other words, there is the process of the gerus of an eved is he goes out of being a goy, a non-Jew, and then, but he didn't become a Jew yet. Now, what is that middle process? And the answer is that middle process, what the Rebbe's understanding is the Kedushas Yisrael he doesn't have. He has the Mitzvahs Milah. And he writes a similar thing in Perik Yudal Alachid Zayin Yisur Rebbe. However, Mutalisa Imai, an Eved can marry his mother, Kishu Eved. He doesn't have relatives. And again, Shekvar Yotza Mechlal Akum. And therefore, he doesn't even have the things that a guy can't do. However, like Bala Yisrael, he's like a hybrid. He's in a state of limbo where he doesn't have either. And that's what he's referring to the Ragat in different places. The idea that there is two parts to Mila. He mentioned the Ragat and Hilchos Mila. I did not find it, but I know that there is such Shiseidas there. That it's obvious that there in Gerus there is the Kedushas Yisrael that happens through Mila, and then there is the and then there is the actual mitzvah of Mila. Now there's a lot to be said about it, but again, it's not for this discussion. So now the Rebbe says, based on this, now let's get the Rambam. What a beautiful Rambam now I have. The Rambam talks about two things, Halacha Ches and Halacha Tes. Halacha Ches, he's talking about the bond of Yidden with the Eibishter, the holiness that comes to a Jew through Bris Milah. And therefore, and Halacha Tes talks about the mitzvah. Therefore, in Halacha Ches, he talks about how we're different than Goyim, separating us. We're in a different league through Milah. And that's the difference between a Yid and a Goy. And also the shleimus that it creates in us. Yeah. And the shleimus that it creates in us. And that's why he writes Gedolei Amila. Chelek Shalom Atshemol. Shleimus of a Yid comes through Milah, meaning the Kedushas Yisrael, the connection to the Eibishter. Now that's why the Rebbe says he adds to that piece that you can't even touch the Milah, you can't even hurt it, you got to stay with it. That's your Kedushas Yisrael. Then comes Halacha Tes. He's not talking anymore about this. Now he's talking about the mitzvah milah, the individual mitzvah milah. And that he wants to show how mitzvah milah is more chomer than any other mitzvah. That's why I use the chamura, not gedayla, because we're not talking about how it's greater than anything else. It's more chamur. And he brings a bunch of proofs to that. And all the proofs he brings are related to the chumrah of the mitzvah. And that's, what does he bring for that? He brings for that Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't given any moment of free time. It shows how serious it is. What a serious mitzvah. And then he brings how it is more common than other mitzvahs, and that's why he compares it to other mitzvahs. Other mitzvahs have 3 brises, this has 13 brises. Whereas the Mishnah is only talking about the first part. And all the proofs it brings are all for the first part. About how our connection to the Eibishter is greater through Milah. And therefore, it doesn't say Chamur, it says Gedela. And it brings them all under one heading. And as I said before, I have this inkling that that's telling us that there is a difference the way the Mishnah understands that Kedushas Yisrael part and the way the Rambam does. And that the Rambam doesn't argue on a Mishnah, of course, so the Rambam has to have a source, and that's for a different time and place, not now. The Yishalmi also is talking about Kedushas Yisrael. That's why the Yishalmi brings the original bris of the bris ben Absarim. Afakert. He wants to show that ultimately a Jew's connection is different. You know, the Mishnah says that if somebody says, I make a neder, then not to have enough from anybody who is an oral, he's allowed to have enough from a Jew. He's allowed to take pleasure from a Jew, because a Jew is not called an oral, even if he doesn't do bris milah. Because there's just like Avram Avinu, before the bris milah already had a connection of a bris to the Eibush. That's the source. Yes, the actual revelation of that connection comes through bris milah. And there's definitely an advantage of the bris milah bringing that connection to reality and fruition. But that's why the Yishalmi, that's the whole Mishnah is going to bring out that point, that we are connected to the Eibishter in a special bris. And that's why the Yishalmi also brings this pasuk. Yishalmi not have to give them 13, he's not have to enumerate 13 specifically. He's enumerate the idea of it. And the Rambam is bringing the actual 13. Okay. So as we said that this does exist in the Rambam, and okay. Now let's talk about a couple of points, and with that we'll conclude. Although there's a lot to talk about what we're talking about, so let's get to it. We mentioned that there is a difference between the way the Rambam refers to Moshe and the way the Mishnah refers to Moshe. The Rambam refers to Moshe as Moshe Rabbeinu, and the Mishnah is Moshe HaTzadik. These things don't happen by themselves. There has to be an intent in that. So what is that intent? What is it? So the Rabbi in the Sicha, Araf 40, he says that the reason that Rambam takes out the word tzaddik, listen to this, is to tell you that this is not specifically because Moshe was such a great person. It's because it's shaykh to every person. It's negeya to everyone, relevant to everyone. Even though the Rambam already said in Perek Aleph, in Hilchas Milah, Perek Aleph, Halach Aleph, that if the father did not do Mila, he waited and he didn't do. He's mevatel a mitzvah, and he don't get kares. And the Arnold also doesn't get kares till the day he dies. So the reason that I'm stressing Rabbeinu because he wants us to bring out that it's relevant to everybody. Where if it's a tzaddik, you think, oh, this is a tzaddik thing, not for as Moshe being as being so great. Okay, so we have to, and again, just pointing out that we need to understand why the Gemara does mention that. Okay, I'll leave it for a different time or a different place. Now, in Parshas Vayetze, there is one time where the Rambam refers to somebody as a tzaddik. Talks about the idea that a worker has to put all his effort into his work. We have very, very, very high standards for employees, and that they have to put all their keiches. And who does the Rambam bring a raya from? In Hilchas Schiras, Perek Gimel Loch Zayin, he writes, "V'chein chayev lamed b'chol keichai, sheyankev atzadik amaki b'chol keichai avad nesoich." Oh, so the Rebbe asks why this strange lashon yankev atzadik, and there he says, "Faket that if you learn Hilchas Deis in Rambam, you come away with a clarity that the word tzaddik refers to a guy who does the right thing, not holy, not necessarily some special person. Forget tzaddik refers to a regular person. There's a contradiction here between what he writes there and what he writes here. There he writes tzaddik is not midas chasidus, and he brings rayas. I mean, you read the Rambam in Hilchos Deis, it's almost clear that it's clear pretty much that that's what it says. So over there in Order 41, he is measure that. He said it's not a steer to what I wrote before. Nilchas Mila, that Lashon Tzaddik would have indicated that perhaps it's only for Moshe Tzaddik. So he says there's a difference when you're talking about Hilchas Deis, when it's talking about Midais, Bein Adam L'Chaveirei. But when you're talking about Hilchas Mila, which is Bein Adam L'Malka, in between the person and the Eibishter, there Tzaddik might mean other meaning of tzaddik, and he shows how the meaning of tzaddik could be somebody who's specifically righteous. Again, and then he ends up, and specifically that he's coming to say the chumrah of mitzvahs mila. How it is so serious that Moshe didn't get any pass on it, even for a moment or for a shah, achas, whatever that means. So the word, you can't write the word tzaddik because then somebody can come along and say, oh, Moshe, yeah, because he was a tzaddik. Didn't get a pass, but a regular person would. That was what he's trying to bring out. The word tzaddik is a different thing. Okay, now again, this needs discussion, but again, we don't have the time for that. We just want to finish the ideas of the Rebbe. There's one other ha'ara that's mentioned in the Sicha, which I want to discuss. The Gemara brought two other things which the Rambam does not mention in the Mishnah. One is Gedei Mila Shadeiches HaShabbos HaChamur. Mila is Deiches Shabbos. There's two. Rabbi Nechemi brings Mila's Deiches Negoy, and the Rambam doesn't bring any of that. So the Rebbe writes, we could say that he's saying that he relies on what he wrote earlier in Hilchos Mila, which he wrote the following: Mila bismana. And there's two kinds of Mila, right? There's a Mila when you do it on the 8th day, or you do it after. Mila bismana on the 8th day, Deiches HaShabbos. As we know, a bris comes out the 8th day of the child comes out on Shabbos. We do a bris. If it's the 9th day and on, we don't do a bris on Shabbos. That's for Mila bismana. Is Deiches Shabbos. Regarding Tzaras, the Rambam writes that Bein Bismana, Bein Shleim Bismana, Deiches at Tzaras. Oh, why didn't the Rambam bring it? So the Rebbe says, because he's relying on what he mentioned there. Perhaps. Says, well, yes, Shleim man, that he's relying on that. I just want to note an interesting thing. Why is Mila Deiches Negoyim? And why is Mila Deicha Shabbos? Mila Deicha Shabbos, let's take first, is a Gzeres HaKosel. It says a posel. B'yei. Because in reality, Mila should not be Deicha Shabbos. Because Mila is a mitzvah aseh. And a mitzvah aseh cannot be Deicha something that's a lois aseh, meaning a negative command, and also has a mitzvah aseh along with it. And Shabbos has both. Now, that takes care of Shabbos, and again, there's a lot to talk about that, but let's focus now on the goy. Mila is deicha negoy. Now, in the Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Kuf Lamed Beis Amud Beis, we learned that out from a pasuk. Yimail besar or losay. And we learn out the word that says besar. You got to cut the piece of meat over there, the piece of flesh, even though there is a beheres. And the Gemara learns it out from a pasuk. And the Gemara goes back and forth and ends up like that. Right? It says, what do you need a pasuk? Esadei says we have a rule. Esadei. So the Gemara says no, because there's a pasuk that says that. The Gemara says no, because the goyim is es and loisasa. So es is not deicha es and loisasa. What's the es and loisasa? Listen to this. So Rashi says there, Hishamer, a loisasa. We know the word Hishamer, even though it doesn't say a lashon don't, but Hishamer is a don't. So it's a loisasa. And it says Velasais and do Kechalash Yairu. That's the asay. That's the asay. Okay, good. We got it. That's the loisasa. So now let's go back to the Mishnah. Mishnah makes a lot of sense. No other mitzvah is deicha negoy. I know what other mitzvah would be, but let's say there would be. Yeah, there could be Nazir, whatever. There would be deicha negoy. Only Mila. Why? Because it's a special dispensation. The pasuk says basar, sar, alos. So therefore, it's more chama than the rest of the time. However, the Rambam has a different take on this whole thing. Both in Hilchas Tumas Saras and in Hilchas Mila. In Hilchas Tumas Saras, he says like this: Mi shahoisa b'herez barlaset. One who has a saras in the arla. Yimail. Why? Shemitzvah say deiches leisas b'chomak. Mitzvah say is deicha leisas b'chomak. Doesn't matter. And then Hilchas Mili writes also. Even here, cutting off the negative ras, yavai esav yitchas leisas. Oh, what are you doing with the Gemara? It's asa leisas. I didn't ask that question. How is it more chama than the rest of the Torah? So the Mishnah Melech says now the Rambam holds the machlekes whether it's an asa leisas. He brings a Gemara in Shabbos Kuf Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph. It brings a brisa that learns from lastly something different. And since it learns something different, you can't use it as an asay. Oh. So, the Chayr Pashtus, you can say, that according to the Rambam, there's no chumrah by the fact that you can be deicha, milas deicha tzaras. Any mitzvah would be deicha tzaras. So, but I'm not that it's an aura. Why the Rebbe mentions that the reason is because he could have mentioned it. Well, the answer is because that's true. He has to say that l'gabe Shabbos, so therefore it's true also l'gabe negoy. But in reality, there is no chumrah of negoyim according to the Rambam, since it's just a regular conventional esadei chalais aseh. Now, based on that, perhaps we can explain other things, but that's not for now. Everybody have a great day and atzlocha rabba and seid gesund und stark.